Our story today begins in the hush of ancient forests, where the wind dances low through towering pine, where fireflies hover like quiet constellations over slow rivers. This is a land already old-shaped by ice and sun, by beasts long gone and people who remembered the land, not with maps, but with stories. Here lived civilizations far older than Jamestown, older than Columbus. Some built cities of earth, others lived by the stars. None called themselves Indians. That name came later with ships and confusion. They were the people-leech tribe with its own word for us, for the people. Along the Mississippi Valley rose the Mississippian mound builders who raised flat-topped pyramids of soil and clay. In Cahokia, across from modern-day St. Louis, stood a great city larger than London in the year 1100. Tens of thousands lived there, gathering beneath the looming monk's mound for ritual, for council, for trade. Some houses were wood and thatch. Some were aligned to the sun. They played a game called chunky, like ancient lacrosse, hurling stone discs across clay fields. The sound of drums echoed across the floodplains. The Mississippi shimmered with dugout canoes. To the east, the Haudenosaunee, what Europeans would later call the Iroquois, dwelt in long houses woven of elm bark. Generations slept under the same roof, fires flickering between central poles. Women chose the leaders. Women could remove them. And long before American democracy took root, these nations formed a league, the great law of peace, that governed 5 nations with council fires and compromise. It's said that Benjamin Franklin studied this league when drafting the early plans of union. To the south, the ancestors of the Pueblo carved cities into cliffsat, Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, where sun-warmed stone glowed golden in the late day. Corn grew in terraced plots. Rainwater was gathered with care. And the stars above were charted by sky watchers who mapped solstices in spirals carved into canyon walls. Silence was sacred. Time moved with the earth. Farther west, the tribes of the Great Basin Ute, Shoshone roamed arid plains where water was scarce. But stories flowed like streams. Each mountain, each spring had a name. Spirits were everywhere. To hunt was not just survival, it was a ceremony. In the north, Inuit and Aleut built homes half buried in snow, carved harpoons from whalebone, and lit lamps with seal oil against the Arctic night. Their world was one of rhythmized thaw, silence, storm. Theirs were lives of endurance, of careful harmony with the cold. In the Pacific Northwest, where evergreens met crashing waves, the Tlingit and Haida carved totem poles that reached toward the rain-heavy sky. Giant cedar canoes split the sea, carrying trade goods, salmon, and songs. Some families lived in longhouses adorned with family crests. Their oral histories were vast passed on in winter dances and firelit chants. All across this wide, wild land stretched thousands of nations, speaking over 300 languages, each with customs and stories, medicine and memory. Some planted the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. Others followed buffalo herds across plains that seemed to have no end. They understood land not as something to own, but as something to belong to. Time was circular. The land was not property, it was breath, ancestor, and guide. Children learned by watching. Elders spoke in metaphor. Stars were storytellers. Spirits were everywhere, in stone, in wind, in the flick of a bird's wing. There was no concept of wilderness, for nothing was empty. All places were full, and yet, in time, whispers came from the sea. Ships. The world was about to change, not in a year, not in a moment, but with the slow, aching sound of wood against water and boots against sand. Diseases would arrive, first smallpox and measles carried in breath and skin, wiping out entire villages before the first white flag was planted. But in this moment, before all that, the land breathed quietly. Uncounted generations lived, laughed, and died under these skies. They mapped the world with memory. They knew when the salmon would run, when the snow would fall. And though their names may be lost to history's louder pages, they were not nameless. They were not voiceless. They are still here. Their descendants still walk this land. Their songs are still sung. Their languages are still spoken, and their wisdom lingers in the wind, if you're quiet enough to listen. The night is still. The fire is low. Our story has just begun. The wind turns colder now, blowing salt and brine in from a horizon we cannot yet see. The forest watches silently as sails appear white and unfamiliar, cutting across the Atlantic like the sharp edge of a new era. Time itself seems to shift, the currents beneath the waves carrying more than ships. They carry names, myths, ambitions. The land does not yet know what they mean. It begins in 1492. Columbus, guided by mistaken maps and imperial hopes, lands in the Caribbean, believing he has reached the Indies. He calls the people he meets Indians, and the word lingers like a misheard echo. Though he never sets foot in what is now the United States, his arrival sends ripples outward that will shape every shoreline, every river, every forest from then on. Spanish explorers follow Hernando de Soto marches through what is now Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and the Mississippi River Valley in the 1540s. He does not find gold, but leaves behind a trail of destruction and disease. Coronado ventures into the American Southwest, chasing rumors of cities made of gold. He finds pueblos carved into sandstone, humming with life and ritual, but no El Dorado. To the north, the French arrive differently. Trappers and Jesuit priests drift into the Great Lakes region, trading furs and words. They learn local languages. They document dreams and customs. They baptize. They map the rivers, but rarely stay long. Canada becomes a French frontier, but even as they press into the Mississippi basin, the land resists permanent transformation. Then come the English. At first, it's a whisper, uncertain touch upon distant shores. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh's colony at Roanoke vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only a carved word, Croton. The mystery remains, but the impulse does not fade. By 1607, a stronger foothold is dug into the soil of the Chesapeake Bay. Jamestown, it is not paradise. Swampy land, mosquitoes, starvation, misunderstandings with the Powhatan Confederacy. Of the 100 settlers who arrive, only 38 survive the first year. Still, they cling to the soil. Tobacco soon takes root, both as a currency. The need for labor rises with every golden leaf. By 1619, two things arrive that will echo through centuries. The first representative assembly in Virginia, the House of Burgesses, and the first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans. It is not yet a system of chattel slavery, but its seeds are planted in the furrows of profit. In New England, a colder climate births a different kind of colony. In 1620, the Mayflower lands at Plymouth Rock. Pilgrims seeking religious freedom stumble onto Wampanoag land. They survive their first winter with indigenous help, thanks to a man named Squanto, who speaks English after years of enslavement in Europe. A feast is shared in 1621, but within a generation, peace frays. The Puritans follow, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unlike the profit-seekers of Virginia, they seek to build a city upon a hill, a model society rooted in scripture, law, and order. Their world is rigid, deeply religious, and distrustful of dissent. Women like an Hutchinson, who challenges the patriarchy with spiritual visions, are banished. A few decades later, in Salem, fear becomes fire. Accusations of witchcraft flare into trials. 19 are hanged. To the south, Maryland is founded as a haven for Catholics. To the north, Connecticut and Rhode Island emerge, some born of rebellion, others from ambition. Roger Williams, exiled from Massachusetts, founds Rhode Island on the belief in true religious liberty and separation of church and state. It is a radical idea in its time, and in New York. Well, it began as New Amsterdam, a Dutch colony carved by merchants and traders. Its streets buzz with languages, its people live by contracts more than creeds. In 1664, it is seized by the English and renamed New York after the Duke of York. But its diversity endures. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, a man named William Penson of an admiral, friend to Quakers, receives a royal land grant. He builds his colony on tolerance, inviting Germans, Dutch, Swedes, and English alike. He pays native tribes for their land, at least at first. His holy experiment becomes one of the most peaceful and diverse colonies. Yet even in this patchwork of faiths and farms, tensions grow. Indigenous peoples begin to push back. In New England, Metacom, known to colonists as King Philip, leads a devastating war in the 1670s, trying to halt colonial expansion. Villages burn, thousands die. By its end, indigenous resistance in the region is largely crushed, and settlers march farther into ancestral lands. And across all 13 colonies, an economy begins to crystallize, built on trade. Tobacco, timber, and increasingly on the backs of enslaved Africans. Ships move in triangular routes, guns and rum to Africa, slaves to the Americas, sugar and goods to Europe. The Atlantic churns with the rhythm of profit. In Charleston, in Boston, in Newport, auction blocks rise. Resistance rises, too quiet, constant, desperate. The colonies are not yet a country, but they are no longer fragile seedlings. By the 1700s, they are growing fast populations, doubling every generation. New towns rise. New roads stretch into the interior, and as they grow, so do their questions about power, about land, about who belongs and who decides. But those whispers are still far off. For now, the lanterns flicker in colonial windows. The forest hums just beyond the fences, and the Atlantic, ever vast, carries the weight of empires on its waves. The colonies now pulse with purpose. From the smoky hearths of Boston to the quiet farms of Pennsylvania, a murmur is forming, a question, not yet shouted, but growing louder with each passing year. Who governs this land, and in whose name? By the mid-1600s, Britain's control over its American colonies is still loose, held together more by trade than by troops. The Navigation Acts begin to tighten this grip, laws meant to ensure that colonial goods flow only to English ports. But enforcement is spotty. Smuggling becomes a silent art, a way of life. Colonial merchants grow bold. Britain watches, half blind, across an ocean. Then, a war changes everything. The French and Indian War begins in 1754, part of a larger conflict known in Europe as the 7 Years' War on American soil. British troops and colonial militias face off against French forces and their native allies. Forts rise and fall in the Ohio River Valley. A young George Washington gains his first command and his first taste of defeat. By 1763, Britain wins. France cedes vast lands east of the Mississippi, but the cost is immense. The British Empire, now drowning in debt, turns its gaze inward toward its colonies. It decides they must help pay for their own protection. The age of salutary neglect ends, and with it, a slow-burning fuse is lit. First comes the proclamation line of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachians. It is meant to avoid more conflict with native tribes, but to colonists hungry for land, it feels like a betrayal. Then come the taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Each one stirs protest. In taverns and town halls, in printed broadsheets and whispered circles, resistance grows. No taxation without representation, they sing not just a slogan, but a declaration of identity. They are British subjects, but the Parliament across the sea speaks without their voice. In 1770, British soldiers fire into a crowd. 5 colonists die. Paul Revere etches it into memory. The Boston Massacre, tensions boil. 3 years later, the Tea Act reignites the fire. In protest, colonists, some dressed as Mohawk warriors, board ships and dump 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Salt water stings the air. The British call it treason. The colonists call it liberty. The Crown answers with force. The coercive acts known here as the intolerable acts shut down Boston's port and revoke Massachusetts' charter. Troops are quartered in homes. Justice is shifted back to Britain. Too many, it feels like martial law. But something unexpected happens. Instead of isolating Boston, these acts unite the colonies. Delegates gather in Philadelphia in 1774. The First Continental Congress. They are not yet calling for independence, but they are speaking as one. Trade is boycotted. Militias prepare quietly. And in towns where lanterns flicker low, children sleep through the hushed forging of rebellion. Spring of 1775 arrives with tension. In Lexington and Concord, British troops march to seize arms. Riders take to the roads, Paul, Revere, and others, warning that the regulars are coming. At dawn, gunfire cracks across the green. No one knows who fires first. The British retreat under fire through hedgerows and barns, past farmers and blacksmiths who now fight not for a king, but for an idea. The fuse has reached the powder. The revolution begins. As the sun rose on April 19, 1775, in the fields of Massachusetts, a world began to tilt. The muskets fired in Lexington and Concord echoed far beyond the colonies. What started as scattered defiance soon burned into a full blaze. By June, colonists dug in on Breed's Hill, overlooking Boston. The British attacked head-on. Twice repelled, they took the ground only on the third charge, but at the cost of over 1,000 men. The Battle of Bunker Hill proved one thing: this rebellion would not go quietly. In Philadelphia, delegates reconvened. The Second Continental Congress formed an army and appointed George Washington as its commander, a tall Virginian, whose dignity and quiet resolve masked a mind of sharp strategy and patience. He took command outside Boston, where ragged farmers stood against the finest army in the world. Gunpowder was scarce. Muskets misfired, but a siege began. The war spread from the forests of upstate New York to the shores of the Carolinas. Colonies became battlegrounds. Patriots fought for autonomy. Loyalists clung to the crown. Native tribes split, some aligning with Britain, others holding to neutrality or siding with rebels. And amid this chaos, a quiet hope grew, a belief that freedom could be not just wished for, but fought for. In 1776, something irreversible happened. A document, written on parchment, thick with meaning, emerged from Independence Hall. On July 2nd, the vote passed. On July 4th, the words were adopted. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence wasn't merely a list of grievances, was a philosophical earthquake, penned largely by Thomas Jefferson. Its words promised liberty, though in practice they were far from universal. Enslaved people were not freed. Women remained voiceless in law. But the words, once spoken, could not be unsaid. The war worsened. In 1776, the British returned in force. New York burned. Washington lost battles, retreated through snow and swamp, and watched hope thin. But in December, he struck back. Under cover of night, crossing the icy Delaware, he led a surprise attack on Hessian mercenaries in Trenton. The victory, small in scale, was vast in spirit. The Revolution breathed again. Winter 1777 brought agony. At Valley Forge, the Continental Army nearly broke. Cold pierced through tents. Food spoiled. Disease spread. But in that frost, resilience formed. A Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, drilled troops into shape. Order replaced desperation. Firewood, when found, became more than warm feed. Was a promise. The fight would continue. And then, France. After the American victory at Saratoga in 1777, the French, keen to wound their British rivals, supplies, ships, soldiers, the conflict, once local, became global. In the South, guerrilla warfare took hold. Militia struck and vanished. British victories turned costly. Cities like Charleston fell, but never easily. Nathaniel Greene's strategy was simple: fight, retreat, fight again. He exhausted his enemy with patience. In 1781, all eyes turned to Virginia. British General Cornwallis entrenched his army at Yorktown. Washington, joined by French General Rochambeau, marched south. French ships blocked the bay. The siege began. For weeks, cannon fire shattered the air. Trenches crept forward. Then surrender. On October 19th, Cornwallis yielded. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris made it official. The United States of America was born not through lineage or inheritance, but rebellion, paper, and perseverance. Yet, peace did not bring clarity. The new nation was fragile. 13 states, each with its own priorities, struggled to function as one. Debts mounted, borders blurred, farmers rebelled. In 1787, leaders gathered in Philadelphia once more. Behind closed doors, they drafted something bold: the U.S. Constitution, with checks and balances. It sought to balance power with liberty. Ratified in 1788, it began a new chapter, one of governing, not fighting. The American experiment would now be tested in silence, not war. And in 1789, George Washington, quiet and reluctant, became the first president. When George Washington took the oath beneath the soft morning light of April 30th, 1789, the new republic stood like a sapling green, hopeful, vulnerable. He spoke little, but carried the weight of unity in his silence. There were no kings now, no thrones, only a constitution, a Congress, and the quiet trust of people watching from farmhouses and city alleys alike. The nation was still small, just 13 states along the Atlantic coast, but its ambitions stretched westward. The government had no permanent capital yet. Washington served first in New York, then in Philadelphia, while a swampy bend in the Potomac was slowly transformed into what would become Washington. D.C. Washington's presidency was cautious. He avoided war, created a cabinet, and stood above party lines, though parties quickly formed beneath him. Alexander Hamilton, sharp-tongued and brilliant, believed in a strong central government, banks, industry, and trade with Britain. Thomas Jefferson, poetic and principled, idealized small farms, limited government, and ties with France. Their visions clashed like slow thunder, birthing America's first political factions, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. In 1794, rebellion rose in Pennsylvania. Farmers refused to pay a whiskey tax, one of Hamilton's revenue plans. But Washington, with great reluctance, led federal troops to suppress it. The show of federal power was clear. The Constitution was no parchment promise. It had teeth. By 1796, weary of power, Washington stepped down. His farewell address, never spoken aloud, but printed widely, warned of entangling alliances abroad and bitter divisions at home. Still, partisanship deepened. John Adams, a Federalist, succeeded him an honorable man, but lacking Washington's quiet command. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in a tense, nearly broken election. The transfer of power between bitter rivals was peaceful, remarkable for the time. Jefferson called it the Revolution of 1800, not with swords, but with ballots. And so began a new phase. Jefferson's vision was expansive. In 1803, he oversaw the Louisiana Purchasate, 128,000 square miles from France, doubling the nation's size overnight. For $15 million, the Mississippi River now flowed fully within U.S. borders, and the dream of reaching the Pacific became real. To explore it, he sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, along with Sacagawea, a Shoshone guide whose presence ensured peace. They moved quietly across plains, rivers, and mountains, cataloging species, trading with tribes, and mapping the unknown. Meanwhile, tensions with Britain rose again. Though the revolution had ended, British ships still captured American sailors and armed native tribes along the western frontier. In 1812, war erupted once more. The War of 1812, sometimes called the Second War of Independence, was chaotic and poorly coordinated. British troops burned the Capitol and the White House in 1814, but American forces held in Baltimore. From Fort McHenry, under rocket fire, a lawyer named Francis Scott Key saw the flag still waving and penned a poem. That poem became the national anthem. In New Orleans, weeks after peace had been signed, but before word had reached them, General Andrew Jackson led a stunning victory. His ragtag army of militia, pirates, and freed slaves repelled seasoned British troops, making Jackson a national hero and foreshadowing a more populist future. After the war, something remarkable happened. For a moment, America felt united. The era of good feelings followed, with James Monroe as president. There was only one major political party. The economy grew. Canals linked rivers. Steamboats churned along waterways. Cotton plantations in the South expanded, feeding textile mills in the North. Slavery, long an unspoken contradiction in the land of liberty, grew entrenched, even as northern states slowly moved toward abolition. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise tried to hold the balance. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine as free. A line was drawn across the continent: slavery allowed below, forbidden above. It quieted tensions, but only for a time. The nation was stretching. Roads were being carved through forests. Settlers moved west. Native lands were sold, seized, or signed away under pressure. America was no longer just an Atlantic story. It was spilling over mountains, across rivers, into territories where law traveled slowly, if at all. And as new voices rose, one man stood tall among them: Andrew Jackson, a general, a populist, and soon a president. Jackson would bring fire to the White House, challenge the banks, force the removal of native peoples, and reshape the presidency into a force of personal will. But that would come soon. For now, the early republic had survived, born in rebellion, shaped in law, tested in war, and expanded by purchase and belief. The United States was no longer just a collection of states. It was a nation, restless, growing, young. When Andrew Jackson entered the White House in 1829, the air of Washington changed. He was no polished aristocrat. Born in a Carolina log cabin, orphaned, young, scarred by the British during the Revolution, Jackson had climbed through war and politics with grit and fury. He was the people's presidentor, so many believed. His supporters called him Old Hickory, tough and unbending. His enemies saw a tyrant cloaked in frontier charm. Jackson's presidency expanded the power of the executive branch. He wielded the veto like a sword, using it more than all previous presidents combined. He dismantled the second bank of the United States, viewing it as a tool of the elite. And when South Carolina threatened to nullify federal tariffs and secede, Jackson responded not with compromise, but with threats of military force. "Disunion by armed force," he wrote, "is treason." But Jackson's most lasting and controversial legacy came in 1830. With the Indian Removal Act, east of the Mississippi, Native American tribes had long coexisted uneasily with settlers. The Cherokee, in particular, had adopted many European American customs, written language, a constitution, even plantation-style farming. They had schools and towns, but gold was found on their land in Georgia. The hunger for expansion grew. Despite a Supreme Court ruling in their favor, Jackson allowed Georgia and other states to defy it. Federal troops forced tens of thousands of Native Americans westward on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from cold, hunger, and disease along the way. As Jackson left office in 1837, the country entered a new period of turbulence and promise. In the South, cotton ruled, made profitable by Eli Whitney's earlier invention. The cotton gin, and sustained by the brutal institution of slavery. Fields stretched endlessly. Enslaved people labored in silence or in song. Families torn apart by auctions. In the North, factories grew louder, drawing in immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and beyond. Canals and railroads stitched the regions together. The Erie Canal linked the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, carrying grain, goods, and ambition. To the west, a different story was unfolding. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to expand coast to coast, hold. Families loaded wagons, traveling the Oregon Trail toward new land and uncertain futures. Some never made it. Others found a harsh, beautiful world waiting. Endless plains, jagged mountains, unfamiliar skies. Texas was part of this dream. Once a province of Mexico, American settlers had begun moving there in the 1820s, seeking land. But tensions flared over language, religion, and especially slavery. In 1836, Texans led by Sam Houston and others declared independence. At the Alamo, a small garrison of Texans, including Davy, Crockett, and Jim Bowie, held off thousands of Mexican troops for 13 days. They were eventually overrun, and all were killed. Remember, the Alamo became a battle cry. Later that year, Texas secured its independence, though Mexico never fully accepted it. For nearly a decade, Texas stood alone as a republic. Then, in 1845, the United States annexed it, setting the stage for war with Mexico. In 1846, war broke out. The Mexican-American War was fought from the Rio Grande to the halls of Mexico City. It introduced America to new generals Zachary, Taylor, Winfield, Scott, and a young officer named Ulysses S. Grant. It was also the war that launched Robert E. Lee. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, ended the war and gave the U.S. vast new lands: California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more. The nation had expanded across the continent. But the question of slavery now loomed larger than ever. Would the new territories be slave or free? Compromise after compromise tried to maintain the balance, but the center was beginning to crack. And on a cold January morning in 1848, as construction began on a sawmill in Northern California, a man named James Marshall saw something shimmer in the river: gold. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 spread faster than wildfire on a prairie breeze. By 1849, tens of thousands had arrived, fortune seekers from New England, the Carolinas, Chile, China, and beyond. They came by ship, by wagon, by sheer will, hoping to find their futures glittering in riverbeds and mountain soil. San Francisco, once a sleepy port, swelled into a sprawling boomtown almost overnight. The gold rush was chaotic and harsh. Few struck it rich, but it pulled California into the fold of statehood quickly in 1850. Just 2 years after the Mexican-American War ended, and with that, the balance between slave and free states teetered again. The Compromise of 1850 tried to hold the Union together. California would enter as a free state. In exchange, the South received a stricter Fugitive Slave Act, requiring even free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. The law enraged abolitionists in the North. Crowds gathered at courthouses. The Underground Railroad, led by brave souls like Harriet Tubman, grew even bolder, shepherding the enslaved to freedom through secret routes, barns, and starlit fields. But time was running out for a compromise. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered the fragile calm. It allowed settlers to decide whether their new territories would permit slavery, effectively nullifying earlier agreements. Violence followed. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded Kansas. Towns burned. People died. Newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas. Across the North, a new political force began to rise, the Republican Party, formed by former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists. It opposed the expansion of slavery. And in 1858, during a Senate race in Illinois, a lanky lawyer named Abraham Lincoln debated Senator Stephen Douglas across the prairie towns. His voice was soft but unshakable. A house divided against itself cannot stand. In the South, Lincoln was seen as a threat. Though he promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, many feared his election would spell the end of their way of life. Then came the flashpoint. In 1859, a radical abolitionist named John Brown led a raid on a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to ignite a slave revolt. The plan failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged, but his final words echoed in still minds. The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged but with blood. A year later, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Within weeks, Southern states began to secede. One by one, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, they left the Union, claiming states' rights and sovereignty. By February 1861, they had formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln had not yet taken office. He arrived in Washington under threat of assassination, traveling secretly by night. When he finally spoke on Inauguration Day, his words were clear, calm, and aching with hope. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. But war was only weeks away. Our story now enters a darker room heavy with smoke and ash, lit only by cannon fire and flickering lanterns. The American Civil War began in April 1861 when Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The shelling echoed across a fractured nation. Lincoln called for troops. The North answered. So did more states in the South. The Union was broken. The country was at war with itself. What followed were 4 years of fire and sorrow. The Union and the Confederacy clashed across forests, fields, rivers, and rail lines. From Bull Run to Shiloh, from Antietam's blood-soaked banks to the thunder of Chickamauga, the battles were brutal. Over 600,000 Americans would die more than in any other war in U.S. history. The North had more factories, more railroads, more men. But the South had generously Jacksonland, home turf. They fought not just to preserve slavery, but to define independence, to resist what they saw as federal overreach. Meanwhile, enslaved people seized the chaos to escape, sabotage, or join the fight for freedom. In 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. By the start of 1863, it became law. All enslaved people in rebelling states were declared free. It was both a moral stand and a military strategy, turning the war into a crusade for liberty and allowing black men to enlist in the Union Army. Over 180,000 would fight. One of the most pivotal moments came that same year in a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg. For 3 days, the hills and wheat fields shook with gunfire. On the final day, Confederate forces made a desperate charge. Pickets charged across open ground. They were torn apart. The tide turned. The South would never fully recover. A few months later, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg. His speech lasted just 2 minutes, 77 years ago. He spoke of a new birth of freedom, of government by the people, for the people, never perishing. In the West, Union General Ulysses S. Grant won victories along the Mississippi, cutting the Confederacy in two. His relentless push through Tennessee and into Georgia came with a cost, but he didn't stop. General William Tecumseh Sherman led the infamous March to the Sea, burning Atlanta and carving a scar through Georgia. His troops destroyed railways, farms, factories, not out of vengeance, but strategy. Total war would end this faster. By April 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell. Surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The two men met quietly in a farmhouse parlor. Grant's terms were generous. The war was over. But peace had no time to bloom. Just 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. He died the next morning, April 15th, 1865. Bells tolled. Crowds wept in silence. The man who had kept the Union together would not see it rebuilt. Our story continues in a fractured land. After the war's end, the United States faced a new kind of challenge, not defeating enemies, but healing wounds. The South lay in ruins. Cities scorched, plantations emptied, railroads twisted. Freedmen once enslaved walked roads with nowhere to go and everything to build. What followed was a fragile, hopeful, and often bitter era. Reconstruction. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, abolishing slavery. Two more followed in its wake. The 14th, granting citizenship to all born in the U.S., including former slaves. And the 15th, declaring that the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of race. These amendments were profound, but in practice, freedom was shadowed by violence and resistance. Freedmen's schools were burned. Black voters were threatened. The Ku Klux Klan rode at night, their white robes concealing hatred. In some counties, federal troops were stationed to protect freed citizens. In others, the dream of equality wilted quickly. During this time, President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, clashed with Congress. He favored leniency toward the South. Congress wanted protection for the newly freed. In 1868, Johnson was impeached by the House, but narrowly acquitted in the Senate. Meanwhile, freedmen began organizing. Churches became community centers. Black politicians like Hiram Revels were elected to Congress. For a brief moment, democracy bloomed more broadly than ever before, but it would not last. By 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South in exchange for a political deal, the Compromise of 1877. Reconstruction officially ended. Southern states quickly passed Jim Crow laws, enforcing segregation, poll taxes, and literacy tests designed to keep Black Americans from voting. A system of racial apartheid settled in, enforced by violence and law. While the South grappled with rebuilding, the North surged forward into what became known as the Gilded Age, a time of dazzling wealth and deep inequality. Railroads stretched like steel vines across the continent, linking coast to coast. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869 at Promontory Point, Utah, with a golden spike. Chinese and Irish immigrants had laid many of the tracks during brutal conditions, freezing mountains and the searing deserts. Industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan amassed fortunes in steel, oil, and finance. Skyscrapers began to rise in Chicago and New York. But beneath the glitter of wealth, millions lived in poverty. Tenement buildings overflowed. Children worked in factories. Strikes erupted in coal mines and rail yards. This was the era of typewriters, barbed wire, and telegraphs clicking through the night. The Statue of Liberty arrived in 1885, a gift from France. Its torch, held high, promised hope to immigrants arriving by shipmany through Ellis Island. They came from Italy, Poland, Ireland, Russia, China, seeking work, fleeing famine or war, chasing a dream. But xenophobia simmered. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 banned Chinese laborers from entering the U.S., the first immigration law to target a specific ethnic group. Out west, life was shifting too. The frontier was closing. Buffalo herds were slaughtered. Native American tribes, resistant to forced relocation and assimilation, faced violence and broken treaties. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 saw Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse defeat Custer. But the U.S. military soon crushed resistance. By the 1890s, most native peoples had been confined to reservations. In South Dakota, 1890, a tragic final chapter came with the Wounded Knee Massacre. Hundreds of Lakota Sioux were killed. It marked the end of Native military resistance. A quiet fell across the plains. As the century turned, America stood at a crossroads, industrial, modern, but restless. Great cities rose into the clouds, while deep inequalities festered below. The seeds of change had been planted, but storms still waited on the horizon. The 1940s arrived under gray clouds. Across the Atlantic, Hitler's Germany had invaded Poland, beginning World War II. Britain held out, but Europe fell into chaos. In the Pacific, Japan's empire expanded, taking Korea, parts of China, and more. The U.S., once again, hoped to remain neutral, even as it aided Britain with arms and supplies through the Lend-Lease Act. But on December 7, 1941, the quiet Sunday sky above Pearl Harbor split open. Japanese aircraft rained fire upon the American naval base in Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans lay dead. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war. The war was total. American factories retooled cars, gave way to tanks, sewing machines to parachutes. Women took jobs in droves, becoming Rosie the Riveters. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards. On the front lines, soldiers fought across Europe and the Pacific. The Tuskegee Airmen, black pilots, flew with valor. The 442nd Infantry Regiment, composed of Japanese American volunteers even, as their families were interned at home, became one of the most decorated units in U.S. history. In 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy Day. A year later, Germany surrendered. But the war in the Pacific continued. Faced with fierce Japanese resistance and unwilling to risk a prolonged invasion, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The devastation was immense. Japan surrendered days later. The war was over. But the world was changed. The U.S. emerged as a superpower. The United Nations formed in hopes of avoiding future global conflict. Yet tensions with the Soviet Union ignited a new, colder war. The The Cold War brought fear and vigilance. America braced against communism at home and abroad. Senator Joseph McCarthy stirred paranoia, accusing many of being Soviet spies. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills. The Korean War began in 1950, ending in a bitter stalemate. In the 1960s, fears of nuclear annihilation peaked during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Soviet missiles were discovered just 90 miles from Florida. But amid fear, the country also flourished. The post-war boom brought suburban homes, color televisions, and interstate highways. Soldiers came home, married, and raised families in what became the baby boom. The GI Bill offered education and housing. Elvis sang. Drive-ins flickered under the stars. The American dream became a white picket fence, yet not all shared equally. In the South, Jim Crow laws still reigned segregation, voter suppression, brutality, but the tide was turning. Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat. The Montgomery bus boycott followed. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached peaceful resistance, his voice echoing through the streets of Birmingham and the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation. A year later, the Voting Rights Act aimed to secure the ballot for all. But progress was hard-won and incomplete. As the 1960s ended, the country felt shaken by assassinations, riots, and the storm of Vietnam. By the late 1960s, a new war had consumed the national consciousness. Vietnam. It was not like the wars before. There were no front lines, no clear victories, just jungles, ambushes, and a mounting toll of American lives. The U.S. entered to stop the spread of communism, believing in the domino theory that if one nation fell, others in Southeast Asia would follow. But Vietnam, a former French colony, resisted with fierce determination. The Viet Cong, using guerrilla tactics and the dense terrain, drew American forces into an unwinnable maze. At home, protests surged. Young Americans questioned the draft, the war, and the government. College campuses became flashpoints. In 1970, 4 students at Kent State University were killed by National Guardsmen during a protest, shaking the conscience of the nation. Folk songs filled the airwaves with sorrow and defiance. The war dragged on. Finally, in 1973, a ceasefire was signed. 2 years later, Saigon fell, and the U.S. withdrew in defeat. Over 58,000 Americans had died, along with countless Vietnamese civilians and fighters. The country was left weary, skeptical, and fractured. In this uneasy calm, another wound opened, this time in Washington. In 1972, burglars broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. What began as a quiet scandal soon revealed a vast web of corruption. President Richard Nixon, faced with impending impeachment, resigned in 1974. It was the first time a U.S. president had done so. His departure left a nation stunned, but also affirmed the resilience of its constitutional guardrails. The economy stagnated. Oil crises led to long gas lines and rising prices. Trust in government waned, but culture shifted. People explored new spiritual paths. Environmentalism rose. Inspired by the first Earth Day in 1970, the women's movement gained strength, demanding equality, choice, and visibility. As the 1980s dawned, a new tone emerged. Ronald Reagan, a former actor and governor, became president. His message was clear: strength, optimism, and smaller government. He promised a morning in America, and many believed it had arrived. Taxes were cut. The military expanded. The Cold War heated briefly, then softened. By the end of the decade, the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union edged toward collapse. Reagan's speeches, like his famous "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," rang with confidence. Technology also began reshaping daily life. Wall Street boomed, giving rise to the yuppie era. But beneath the glossy surface, the AIDS crisis took hold, claiming lives while the government was slow to respond. Activists fought for awareness, research, and compassion in a time of fear. The United States, entering the 1990s, stood at the edge of a new digital, globalized World One, built on change, memory, and hope. The 1990s began with quiet confidence. The Cold War had ended, and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. Under President George H.W. Bush, a swift military response called Operation Desert Storm pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, showcasing American strength in the Gulf War. The conflict was brief and televised, like a global stage play, watched in real time by millions back home. Yet, just as the external threats seemed to retreat, internal complexities rose. In 1992, a young Arkansas governor named Bill Clinton won the presidency, bringing a new blend of charisma and pragmatism. His era was marked by prosperity fueled by a tech boom, a balanced budget, and the rise of the internet, which shifted how Americans worked, learned, and connected. Dial-up tones, AOL emails, and the first viral websites whispered the start of a digital age. Culturally, the nation was changing too. Hip-hop music surged from inner cities into the mainstream. Indie films told quieter, more personal stories. Americans began confronting hard truths about race, gender, and justice. In 1992, the Rodney King beating and subsequent Los Angeles riots revealed wounds that hadn't healed. But there was movement slow, halting, but visible. By the end of the decade, Clinton faced scandal over an affair with a White House intern, leading to his impeachment by the House of Representatives. He was acquitted by the Senate, and his approval ratings remained high. Politics, now more than ever, was a spectacle. Then came the year 2000, with its uncertain dawn. A contested election between George W. Bush and Al Gore led to recounts and legal battles. The Supreme Court ultimately declared Bush the winner. It felt like history stuttering, unsure of its next step. And then, on September 11th, 2001, the skies broke. 4 hijacked planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a quiet field in Pennsylvania. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost. Smoke billowed against the Manhattan skyline. Sirens echoed through silence. The nation wept. The world changed in a day. America responded with resolve. The War on Terror began. Troops were sent to Afghanistan to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban. Later, in 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, seeking weapons of mass destruction that were never found. The wars stretched into decades. Soldiers cycled in and out. The cost in lives and treasure was immense. At home, the Patriot Act reshaped privacy laws. Airports became fortresses. Fear mixed with patriotism, and a new era of security began. Meanwhile, in cities and homes, technology kept marching. Social media emerged, first MySpace, then Facebook, Twitter, and beyond. Smartphones put the world in every pocket. A generation grew up online, tethered to glowing screens. Connection deepened, but so did disconnection. In 2008, history turned another page. Amid a deepening financial crisis, Barack Obama was elected the 44th president, the first African American to hold the office. His campaign, built on hope and change, inspired millions. Yet, the path ahead was steep. The Great Recession had gripped the nation. Banks failed. Jobs disappeared. Families lost homes. Obama's administration launched stimulus packages, saved the auto industry, and passed the Affordable Care Act, expanding healthcare to millions. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in his first year, and later in 2011. Under his leadership, Osama bin Laden was located and killed in Pakistan. It was a symbolic, close to a long and painful chapter, but division was growing. Social media sharpened differences. Echo chambers formed. While progress surged in areas like marriage equality and renewable energy, old tensions resurfaced in race, class, identity. As the 2010s waned, the nation looked ahead to a stormier horizon. In 2016, the world watched as the United States elected a man who had never held public office. Donald J. Trump, a billionaire businessman and television personality, defeated Hillary Clinton, a seasoned politician with decades of public service. The result shocked pollsters and divided communities. Where Clinton had promised stability and experience, Trump offered disruption, a vow to drain the swamp, and a direct, sometimes incendiary style that upended political norms. The election revealed deep rifts: suburban versus rural, coastal versus heartland, globalist versus nationalist. Campaigns became battlegrounds of identity and fear. News blurred into opinion. Facts were debated as fiercely as ideologies. And through it all, the internet pulsed with memes, accusations, and tribal loyalty. During Trump's presidency, America saw sweeping changes. Tax reform lowered corporate rates. Deregulation accelerated. Federal courts filled with conservative judges. Trade wars began, particularly with China, as tariffs returned and supply chains strained. Immigration policies tightened. Families were separated at the border. The Paris Climate Agreement was abandoned, and America's alliances abroad became less certain, its diplomacy more transactional. Yet, the economy grew. Unemployment fell. For a time, stock markets surged and wages rose. The tension between chaos and prosperity became a daily current. Then, in early 2020, an invisible enemy arrived. COVID-19, a novel coronavirus, spread from city to city, continent to continent. Businesses shuttered. Streets fell silent. Hospitals overflowed. Masks became symbols. So did loneliness. Schools moved online. Grandparents waved through windows. Over 1 million Americans would eventually die from the virus. The government's response was uneven. Lockdowns came, lifted, and returned. Some states closed completely. Others resisted. The federal tone shifted, often erratically. Scientists urged caution. Others demanded reopening. Vaccines arrived in record time, thanks to unprecedented collaboration and funding, but misinformation shadowed their rollout. As 2020 drew to a close, the country voted again. This time, amid mail-in ballots and pandemic protocols, Joe Biden, a veteran Democrat and former vice president, won the presidency. He promised unity, healing, a return to calm governance. Trump disputed the results, claiming fraud without evidence. On January 6, 2021, protest turned to insurrection. Supporters of the outgoing president stormed the U.S. Capitol, breaching its chambers during the electoral vote certification. The nation and the world watched in disbelief. Windows smashed, offices looted, lawmakers hid beneath desks. It was the first time the Capitol had been invaded since the War of 1812. But democracy held. The certification resumed. Biden was inaugurated under heavy guard, as the National Mall stood empty of crowds and filled with flags. The months that followed were consumed by recovery of lives, trust, and public health. Vaccines expanded. Mandates came and went. Schools reopened. Yet the virus lingered, mutating into new strains. Economies strained. Workers reevaluated their lives. A great resignation reshaped labor. Rent rose. So did hope. Biden's presidency passed massive infrastructure funding and recommitted America to climate leadership. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, however, ended in chaos, as images of helicopters over Kabul echoed memories of Saigon. Allies questioned, enemies watched, and at home the divide deepened. In every corner of the country, the past clashed with the present, statues removed, histories rewritten, rights redefined. Protests surged over police brutality, abortion access, gun violence, climate urgency, and trans rights. America seemed always in motion, never fully at rest. And yet, in the quiet moments, it endured. A teacher helped a child read behind a mask. A farmer watched the dawn roll in across frost-covered fields. A nurse held a stranger's hand. A song played in a subway tunnel, echoing beneath the city. By 2024, America stood at a familiar crossroads, facing a new election, new challenges, and the same timeless question: who are we, and who do we wish to become? The year brought debates on climate, debt, education, and privacy. Artificial intelligence began reshaping not just industries, but imagination. Cars whispered instead of roared. Satellites blinked in expanding constellations. And somewhere deep in government labs and college dorm rooms, minds shaped tools that would redefine the next century. Social media, once a means of connection, now teetered between obsession. Algorithms softened. Algorithms softened. A new generation born entirely in the 21st century took the reins not just in protest, but in poetry, code, and invention. America's great cities swelled with cranes and condo towers, while its small towns, resilient and slow-burning, stitched themselves together with murals, copes, and memory. Immigrants continued to arrive, not just from across seas, but from neighbors and war zones, drawn by the same mythic promise, the chance to begin again. In classrooms across the land, history was debated, retold, reframed. Young students learned not just about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, but about Harriet Tubman, Fred Korematsu, Cesar Chavez, and Marsha P. Johnson. America's story expanded. Like a quilt with new squares, added not to replace the old, but to better reflect the whole. And in museums, libraries, and archives, faded documents still whispered scripts of revolution, maps of stars, letters between strangers who believed the future would be better than the past. That, perhaps, was always the quiet heartbeat of the United States. Not perfection, not certainty, but movement, always reaching toward something still unseen, sometimes stumbling, sometimes leaping, but never fully stopping. Even when divided, even when weary, America dreamed with messy, hungry hope. A country of contradictions, and yet one that kept trying. A place where jazz was born in back alleys, and rockets rose from swamps. Where enslaved hands once built walls, but generations later, descendants walked through those halls as leaders. In the softest hours, midnight diners, in quiet train cars, on porches with rocking chairs, the people still believed in each other, or at least wanted to. They told stories, shared recipes, voted, volunteered, grieved, grieved together, celebrated small wins, raised flags, lit candles. They built, broke, rebuilt, and now, as we return from this long, winding journey from woodland fires to wireless towers, from handwritten constitutions to digital protests, the present feels both heavy and light, heavy with responsibility, light with possibility. Outside your window, perhaps there's a breeze, or the hum of distant traffic, or silence. Somewhere, a child is being born. Who will live to see a century you cannot imagine? Somewhere else, a grandparent sits in a recliner, remembering how things used to be and smiling at how far we've come. Our story does not end. It continues, quietly, like the stars over Lexington, the lanterns of Gettysburg, the torch lifted on Ellis Island. America was never just a place. It's a promise. And now, as the sky softens and the lights dim once more, you can rest knowing you've walked through time. From the first whispered myths beside firelight to a land of humming cities and open roads, you've seen it all. And somewhere beneath the vast turning sky, the story continues.